So this is the cover of my little book, Perseverance, and it's very small, meant to be carried with you and used in times of emergency, uh, of which there are daily ones. But the cover is itself, to me, a testimony for how we persevere. The artist is Asante Salam, who is a New Orleanian, and before Katrina struck, she and her family dispersed. The great tragedy of Katrina, well, there were several, but it wasn't really the destruction of property as much as it was the destruction of community, because they had between 75 and 110 identifiable communities and families that were together living next door to each other for generations. And the second great tragedy is they haven't let the black people back in. You know, it's really changed as a city. So Asante Salam was a well-trained artist, and she dispersed to San Diego. The rest of her family went elsewhere. They got out well ahead of the storm. And she said that she created this on a day when she started to feel life coming back into her after this great trauma. And what she did is she took a cardboard box, which you can see the folds here. So she took the inside of a cardboard box. She took real blossoms. She had white tissue paper. She just started tearing it. She had a charcoal pen. And so out of very few resources, but sufficient, she created something of beauty, which is always possible to us, you know. But what's involved with persevering is beautifully described in the Chinese character, which is a knife suspended over a human heart. This is very ambiguous. It could mean dozens of things. It probably does mean dozens of things. But I have myself favored two explanations, one of which is it's a perilous path. At any moment, that knife could drop and just slice you in half. And the second is that as one was a Australian Chinese Zen nun told me that her teacher had given her this character for her lifelong study, and she interpreted it as when you're on the path with heart, which is the warrior's path, your heart will be sliced open, but in good ways, which means your compassion will increase. So I like both of those, and they're quite different. But certainly one thing it says is you got to watch out here. Not going to be easy, right? So I think the first thing is for us to recognize we're all here because we have people in our direct ancestry who persevered. I'll name my English grandfather, John William Wheatley, who was served in the Boer War, was traumatized, came back, raised with my grandmother, who I'm named after, Maggie Wheatley, raised 5 children in extreme poverty with a post-traumatic stress husband, and then World War I broke out. You know? And she persevered too. Well, you can be shy about this, but please do think about them, because just as we hope our children and grandchildren will remember us for our capacities to persevere, you wouldn't be here without these ancestors. Just go back 1 or 2 generations, they're there. So one of my teachers has said, you know, it's just our turn, that's all. You know, no big deal. It's just our turn to be the people who are willing to step forward and persevere through times that are difficult, but certainly do not involve material difficulty. It's all emotional, psychological stress, right? So this is what people who persevere encounter. It's not a pretty list, but it's normal. And it increases for people who are in a formal organization with a formal role, such as yourselves, who are trying to do things differently. Because you will get criticized for trying to do it differently. Or you will be invisible for trying to lead differently. Or you will, if people decide they don't like you and they can't find any fault in what you've done, they will slander you personally. This happens to a lot of leaders. So the role that you are in, should you choose to accept it, which is to really try and lead in a more thoughtful, inclusive, participative way, puts you at risk. That's why Rudolf Barrow said that those few who are not afraid to be insecure, it puts you at risk, because the best thing that will happen if you do things differently is that you'll be invisible. And I mean that quite seriously now. Being below the radar is a gift. We have to give up our ego needs to want respect and approval and some kind of reward for doing things so well. But basically, if you can be invisible, you can get a lot more done. You know, if you're far from main office, you get a lot more freedom. So it's wise to expect these things and not take them personally. The criticism you will receive is built into the role. Doesn't have to be rational, it won't be rational, it's just built into the role. Or people who will obstruct you or slander you or deny you've done anything useful. It's just built into the role. So being free of needing to be approved and respected and held up as a role model, all these wonderful sources of approbation. Being free of those needs at a psyche level is a really good place. It's hard, very hard, but it creates some freedom for you. So that's your future. Anyone ready to sign up? You already did though, didn't you? So here's how we get through those negativities. You've already seen this phrase, to pay exquisite attention to relationships. What this means is you have to be the one who calls other friends. You have to be the one to initiate contact. You have to be the one to notice how much time you are not spending with your children, and how shut up, I'm busy is one of the things that we have to notice in ourselves. With your partner, none of this changes until you take deliberate action to be present for the people in your life that you love, that love you. That's at home, maybe a little bit at work, but definitely at home. And then at work, you need to be the boss who does, as was mentioned, take time. I listened to I can't remember where I met this man recently, but he came up to me and he said, I have 100 direct reports. That's shocking, right? But he said, I have 3 rules. I only remember 2 of them, but I'm sure the third was great too. He said, the first rule is I tell my staff I do not have an open door all the time. Sometimes it's open and sometimes it's closed. And if you need to speak to me when it's closed, knock. But, I'm not all the time available to you. That's helpful, right? And the second of the three that I recall was he said, if you need to come in my office and vent, you are invited in to do that. Because he said, that's where I get so much information. And I asked him, I said, so does that lower the temperature of the ventor, of the person who just needs to get it out of their system? Because if you actually give him permission to do that and not told to forget about it, then I would imagine, it sort of diffuses it from the beginning. He said people cry, they sob, they'll yell, they'll swear, but then it's over with. And he's got all his insight without judging them as bad people. I don't think I'll ever remember what the third one was, so we'll live with those two. I often get people who rush up to me and give me these little gems, and then they're gone like, who was that masked manager? So I would ask you, in terms of this, to really pay attention to your levels of criticism, judgment, snap judgments, and to tune into what's really the tenor of life in your home and in your team. Because if we're willing to notice, we can notice these things. What's the level of trust, the level of criticism, the level of judgment, and how is it changing, as I said earlier? And then one of you mentioned, I think you mentioned this as a strategy, at the end of the day when you're feeling despair, to remember why you're doing this work. Sometimes it's enough, sometimes it's not. But the other great usefulness for this question is to do it with your team periodically, especially when you've gone through a rough period. You just get together and talk about, why did I come into this field of health or community service or social welfare? Why did I come into this? What was I thinking I might accomplish, or what still keeps me motivated? Usually people will talk about some original idealism, but then they'll talk about a specific person that they just helped yesterday. And that's enough. I mean, the more direct contact we have with our clients, I find the more life-sustaining that is, right? So getting out and meeting people and seeing the impact of what all your hard labor is very important, but occasionally going back to an original hope that we held for doing this work. And you'll hear some pretty amazing stories from colleagues of their motivation after you've assigned them to the permanent jerk status. You'll realize they were really trying to do something good here. The most profound experience I ever had with this question was I was facilitating a conversation at a museum in a university. And there was a Chinese woman there who'd been there for 3 years, and I think people didn't really know her. And when we went around, why do you do your work? She told of her mother being an art teacher. And during the Chinese terrible revolution, when all the academics and intellectuals were hauled off and made to work in the fields, that her parents were both taken away, and she had to raise her 2 siblings I think she was 9. And for 7 years, they lived without their parents. And they used to make clothing. She used to sew clothing from little cloths she found here and there. It's an incredible story. And then her parents came back. That was really good news. But she said, I'm working in an art museum to honor my mother. Do you know how we all felt at that point? We felt so incredibly superficial. Like life had been so easy for us. And so she changed in our eyes forever. So this is a good conversation to have, especially if you've gotten into a really bad place with one another. Just sit down. Let's talk about why we're willing to keep going here. So personal conversation with your beloved, your partner, but also as a staff group. And then you've heard me say this ad nauseum at this point. But here I mean it personally. How often do you really take time for deep reflection, where you're just going away out into nature usually works the best, or going to the ocean, the sea, or this is a photo from my adopted home in Utah, which is just vast, hundreds of millions of years of evolution shown in the rocks. If you have a certain routine and it involves a certain place, after you've been there a couple of times, your whole body knows what you're there for. And this is useful for a lot of different things in your life, but to have a thinking place, to have a quiet place, and then when you are there, your body comes along with you and goes, okay, jumps up and down. But seriously, just don't leave this to fate or one day I'll do this or happenstance. If you can find a place that really soothes you, or it may be a piece of music, or it may be a particular flower garden, or it may be a tree, but if it really starts to settle you, don't be afraid of it. Just keep going back to that particular place or music or tree, and you'll see it has great benefit. So here's a big one. We have to keep a sense of humor. I'm a big proponent of black humor these days, because what I find with humor is that it lifts us out of the situation. We have good fun with it, really express it in a lot of clarity, and that it gives us the ability to go back in. So it's one of the things I like to ask in an organization now, like, what's the level of black humor? Not, despairing cynicism or always finding the laugh. But it is, for me, a great relief to be able to just pop up above it all, be very brilliant and witty as a group, and then we go back in. It's a real stress reliever, and it helps us keep perception going, perspective of what's really going on and how crazy it is, but we're still in there. Know any good jokes? Anyone here? And now we get to what for me is a really big need for leaders. Do you have a practice that reconnects you with a sense of inner peace? That's what this question really means. I've asked this question a lot. For some people, it's gardening, horseback riding, dog training, music playing, art, crafts. That's the first level. Then for others, it's prayer or meditation. And the important thing is to have a practice that leaves you connected to the fact that we do carry peace within us. Because we ain't going to find it in the outer world anymore. We can find moments of grace and joy, working hard together, but we're not going to find peace. So if you have a practice, maybe I didn't list it, but if you have a practice, please consider whether it's sufficient. And if you don't have a practice, please find one. I don't think leaders can get through this craziness without having some way of connecting to a greater whole. That it's not just the NHS, it's not just me, it's not just this time, but I feel connected, whether it's to nature or to spirit or to ancestors, but something beyond this moment in time and something beyond this little tiny sense of self. Without that, I don't know how people persevere. Well, they don't. They drink, or they go into addictions of some sort. And that's growing also. So for me, there is no other way to maintain stability and confidence without having a practice of knowing that peace is available, but it's all in here, not out here. We can't make it on our own through this. We just can't. So that's in line with the last thing I want to say in support of creating community among yourselves. Many years ago, one of the formative gigs of my work life, I was invited to work for the head of the U.S. Army. And he said he wanted to see the Army through my eyes. I'd never been in the military. It was a brand new field of inquiry. And it's where I really learned what warriorship is. Different values, but commitment to a cause and commitment to each other. And so in my very first meeting in the Pentagon, General Gordon Sullivan, the Chief of Staff, said, "Here's a quote, Meg, and once you understand this, you will understand the heart of being a soldier." And the quote came from the Civil War, from a letter that General Sherman, who had just ravaged, the South, burned everything and won for the North. General Sherman was writing it to the commanding general, General Ulysses S. Grant, who then became president after Lincoln. And General Sherman was exploring in this beautiful letter why they won. And this was the phrase that the current General Sullivan read out to me. He said, General Sherman said to Grant, "The reason we won the war was I always knew you thought of me, and that if I got in a tight place, you would come if alive." So, I always knew you thought of me, and if I got in a tight place, you would come if alive. So we use the phrase quite lightly these days, "I've got your back." Do you use that here? Yeah. I'm here for you. But what does it really mean in terms of a small group of colleagues or friends who really are here for us? That we can talk with when we're down, we can talk with when we're high, we can talk with when we just need someone to listen. Who can listen to us and then reflect back to us, you're sounding more and more stressed, or every time we talk, you sound like you're in the point of tears, or wow, you really did achieve something. Just a good listener who reflects back to us what they heard. Do you have those people in your life? This is the heart of, this is what gives us strength if we're going to take on this warriors for the human spirit role. This is what gives us strength, is having a small group of friends, colleagues, that we can call in a moment. Speed dial now, you know. It's not as quite poetic as I always knew you thought of me and you would come. It doesn't quite have that feel, but I've been in groups of leaders who are part of a leadership program. And the first thing they do is put each other's numbers in their phones. And they make a pledge, if I see your name come up, I will answer the call, which is a big deal these days, right? When I've talked to ex-military, they say, you know, even to this day, if one of my old buddies calls me and says, I need you, I don't ask why, I just show up. I've been starting to practice this, and it's a pain in the butt. Seriously, I have a nice few days programmed out. I'm finally going to get some time to myself, and a friend calls me, and I realize she's really in emotional trouble. I better go visit her. But then, of course, it's deeply satisfying. So it pits my own selfish needs against just being there for each other. But I've now had the experience of people being there for me, and I know what that feels like. So I really honor the attempt here. I would only say as descriptors of what makes this work is it should just be a few people you can really count on. You know, as a collective group, you can get lost to each other. Or it could just be friends or colleagues on the outside who are not in your system, not in your organization, but who you know I can call no matter what. We need these people now. We really need each other this way. I find in my own experience of this kind of group, what's been so helpful is we're not counseling each other. We might be consoling each other at times, but mainly we found that if I can just express what I'm noticing about my own behavior, like on one call, a CEO friend of mine who's in this little group said, I just notice I'm not recovering from my anger as quickly as I used to. It's lasting longer. We weren't going to say anything. What would you say? Like, yeah, that's not a good thing. Okay, he already knew that. We're not going to give him a practice or a book to read or anything about managing anger. We're just listening. And in the telling of it, he sees a way through, and he starts to feel more in control. So listening to each other from this place of non-interference, but pure, let me hear it. Just being that kind of quality listening board is really, really useful because we can solve our own problems. We can work to help ourselves. So I seriously encourage you in this direction. It will help you stay sane and focused and strong in the midst of everything that's plaguing you. Okay? So I want to close this by sharing with you a prophecy of this time that comes from the Hopi Nation in the southwest United States. This was a prophecy they issued in 2000. Their stewardship, tribal calling, if you will, is the planet. So they've got a very tough job these days, and they have appeared before the United Nations. They have had letters read in public by their elders. And this one I find particularly moving. Its subtitle is To My Fellow Swimmers, because this is how they describe this time. Here is a river flowing now very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid, who will try to hold on to the shore. They are being torn apart and will suffer greatly. Know that the river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, and keep our heads above water. That's the first part of the prophecy. There's more coming, but a description of this time and who we choose to be as leaders. Clinging to the old ways or bravely pushing off into the middle of the river and making sure we keep our own heads above water so we can serve others. Here's how we serve others. And I say, who is there with you and celebrate? At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. You can all just have a sigh of relief over that one. For the moment we do, our spiritual growth and journey come to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration, for we are the ones we have been waiting for. So it's just our turn. It's not quite what we signed up for, but it is now our turn to be leaders who can serve with effectiveness and heart and mind fully engaged. So I think we're going to end a little bit early. How's that? Is that good? Thank you for your being here today. Thank you.